The base fell silent the moment the wreckage appeared on radar. Not the comfortable silence of routine operations, but the held-breath quiet that precedes something terrible. Tower controllers leaned toward their screens, watching a single blip limp across the display at an altitude that should have been impossible. The aircraft was barely airborne, flying on what seemed like willpower alone, and every soul in that room knew they were witnessing either a miracle or a disaster still unfolding. Captain Nadia Kavar had launched 6 hours earlier as part of a routine close air support package over the Tainsroof Basin. The mission brief had been standard: provide overwatch for a Ranger element conducting high-value target interdiction deep in contested territory. Her A-10C Thunderbolt II, call sign Granite 42, carried a full combat load: 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition, 6 AGM-65 Mavericks, and enough flares to light up the Sahara. She'd flown the profile 100 times before. Radio checks were crisp, weather was clear, intel was solid, everything was routine until it wasn't. The first indication of trouble came at 0947 Zulu, when her wingman's frantic transmission cut through the tactical frequency. The words were clipped, professional, but edged with something controllers rarely heard from combat pilots: genuine fear. Granite 41 reported that Kavar had taken catastrophic ground fire during a gun run, her entire left side erupting in smoke and flame. He'd watched pieces of her aircraft separate and spiral earthward, glinting in the morning sun like terrible confetti. The A-10 had rolled inverted, hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid and trailing black smoke across the desert sky. Every indicator said she was going down. 41 had already begun transmitting combat search and rescue coordinates when Kavar's voice returned to the net, barely audible through static and the scream of dying engines. She was still flying. Somehow, impossibly, she was still flying. But now, approaching City Boozid forward operating base with both engines flamed out, zero hydraulics, and flight controls responding through emergency reversion mode alone, Kavar was attempting something no one in that tower had ever seen successfully completed. She was trying to deadstick a 43,000-pound attack aircraft onto a 6,000-foot runway with battle damage that should have killed her an hour ago. The tower supervisor, a lieutenant colonel with 22 years and 3 wars behind him, stood motionless at the window. His hand rested on the crash phone. His eyes never left the horizon where that dying A-10 would appear. Behind him, a young airman whispered a prayer. No one told him to stop. The Thunderbolt materialized through heat shimmer like something conjured from nightmare. Even from 3 miles out, the damage was visible. The entire left engine nacelle was gone, simply missing, leaving a jagged wound that wept smoke. The left horizontal stabilizer hung at an unnatural angle, its actuator severed, control surfaces frozen. Hydraulic fluid painted a rainbow trail across the fuselage, mixing with soot and streaking backward in the slipstream. The left main landing gear door flapped loose, banging against the airframe with each gust of wind. This wasn't an aircraft. This was a debris field that hadn't finished scattering. Yet it flew with a kind of terrible grace, nose high, trading what little airspeed remained for every precious second aloft. Kavar had trimmed the aircraft with a sculptor's precision, using differential thrust from an engine that no longer existed, coaxing lift from surfaces that should have torn free miles ago. She'd become part of the machine, thinking in terms of pressure and drag, feeling through the stick what couldn't be measured or displayed. The A-10 was dying, but it was dying under control, and that made all the difference between tragedy and legend. The tower frequency remained silent except for Kavar's breathing and the occasional crackle of static. No one dared speak. They watched the Thunderbolt descend through 1,500 feet, then 1,000, the desert floor rising to meet it with geological indifference. At 500 feet, Kavar's voice returned, steady and focused. Granite 42, final, gear down and welded. 3 clicks acknowledged. The tower held its breath. She crossed the threshold at 98 knots, 40 knots too fast, the aircraft shuddering as damaged surfaces disrupted airflow. The nose remained high, tail low, wings wobbling as Kavar fought invisible battles with a machine that barely answered. The main gear touched first, both tires exploding on contact, rubber and cord shredding across concrete. The aircraft bounced, the damaged wing dipping, scraping pavement and throwing sparks that looked like fireworks in the harsh sun. Kavar corrected with aileron she didn't have, using rudder to keep the center line, and somehow the A-10 settled back down, grinding forward on bare rims and determination. The nose gear collapsed at midfield. The aircraft pitched forward, the nose digging into concrete, and for one terrible moment it seemed the Thunderbolt would cartwheel, would tumble and disintegrate and take Kavar with it. But the airframe held. The nose plowed a furrow down the runway, metal screaming, pieces flying, until momentum finally bled away and the wreckage shuddered to a stop 800 feet from the far end. Emergency crews were already rolling, foam spraying, but everyone in the tower stood frozen, staring at the broken aircraft resting in a cloud of its own destruction. Captain Nadia Kavar emerged from the cockpit 40 seconds later, climbing down the ladder with careful, measured movements. She stood beside her wrecked A-10, removed her helmet and looked back at what she'd just done. Her hands didn't shake. Her expression revealed nothing. She simply nodded once, to herself or to the aircraft, then walked toward the approaching vehicles. Behind her, Granite Fortu sat silent and shattered, its tail number still visible through the smoke, 790147. It would never fly again, but it had flown long enough. The base erupted into activity as medical crews reached Kavar, but she waved them off, refusing the stretcher they brought. She was walking under her own power, talking, answering questions with clinical precision about systems failures and control inputs. The flight surgeon cleared her reluctantly, noting elevated heart rate but finding no injuries requiring immediate intervention. By all metrics, Captain Kavar was fine. By all logic, she should have been dead 2 hours ago. The Ranger element she'd been supporting radioed in 30 minutes later. Their mission had been successful, high-value target captured, no friendly casualties. They'd watched her take the hit, watched her aircraft disintegrate around her, and assumed they'd lost their close air support. But Kavar had stayed on station for another 40 minutes after the strike, circling despite catastrophic damage, ready to prosecute targets if her people needed her. She'd only turned for home when her wingman threatened to physically escort her back to base. The Rangers, men who made legends their business, were requesting formal commendation for a pilot they'd never met. Word spread through the base with the speed of wildfire. By sunset, every squadron knew the story. The single mom who'd dead-sticked a battle-damaged hog across 300 miles of hostile desert. The pilot who'd refused to punch out, refused to leave her aircraft, refused to accept that some things were impossible. Captain Nadia Kavar, call sign Widow, had just entered military folklore whether she wanted to or not. But in the operations center that evening, reviewing gun camera footage and flight data, a different picture emerged. The damage Kavar had sustained wasn't just catastrophic. It was precisely targeted, systematically delivered, and far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The strike that should have killed her hadn't been lucky enemy fire. It had been a coordinated ambush using advanced weapons systems that shouldn't have existed in that theater. Someone had known exactly where Granite Fortu would be, and exactly how to kill an A-10 Thunderbolt. Intelligence analysts pulled imagery and communications intercepts, building a timeline that didn't make sense. The enemy force that engaged Kavar had been waiting in position for 47 minutes before her arrival. They'd had Russian-made Verba MANPADS, fourth-generation missiles with infrared seekers sophisticated enough to defeat standard countermeasures. The weapons were fresh from crates, serial numbers indicating manufacture within the last 6 months. This wasn't battlefield salvage or old Soviet surplus. This was recent hardware delivered through supply chains that someone had funded, organized, and deployed specifically for high-value targets. The kind of hardware used to kill American aircraft flown by pilots with names on targeting lists. The question no one wanted to ask was simple and terrible. Had Captain Kavar been specifically targeted? And if so, why would anyone burn such sophisticated weapons on a routine close air support mission? The answer, when it finally emerged from classified channels, would prove more complex than anyone imagined and would transform Kavar from a local hero into something far more significant. Nadia Kavar sat in the debriefing room at 0200 hours, still in her flight suit, telling the story for the fourth time. Her voice remained steady, her recall precise, but exhaustion showed in the way she held her coffee mug, gripping it like an anchor to something familiar. Across from her sat three colonels, two from intelligence and one from her own chain of command, plus a civilian whose credentials no one questioned but whose presence made everyone uncomfortable. "Walk us through the moment you took the hit," the intelligence colonel said. His name was Brennan, and he had the careful demeanor of someone used to asking questions nobody wanted to answer. "Specifically, we need to understand your decision-making process regarding ejection." Kavar set down her mug. The master caution panel lit up like Christmas. I had fire warnings on the left engine, hydraulic pressure dropping to 0, flight control degradation warnings, and the aircraft rolled inverted without input. Standard procedure says eject. But I was directly over the Ranger position at 3000 AGL, and I had 6 Mavericks still on the rails. She paused, choosing words carefully. If I punched out, that aircraft was going to impact somewhere in their operational area. 43,000 pounds of jet fuel, ordnance, and wreckage. I made the call to try controlling it. "That's not procedure," the civilian said quietly. His accent was East Coast, educated, the kind of voice used to being obeyed. "That's not even close to procedure." "No, sir, it's not." Kavar met his eyes without flinching. "But my people were on the ground and I had options. I still had one engine, some control authority, and altitude to work with. I used them." The second intelligence colonel, younger, leaned forward. "Captain, did you at any point during the engagement observe coordinated fire, multiple launch points, any indication this was a prepared ambush?" There it was, the question they'd been circling for an hour. Kavar's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere. "Negative. Single launch point, mountainside position approximately 074 degrees from my approach vector. The missile came up fast, defeated my flares, and struck the left engine nacelle. Clean hit, professionally executed." She paused. "But sir, I wasn't looking for an ambush. I was focused on target coordinates. If there were other indicators, I missed them." Brennan pulled up imagery on the laptop between them, rotating it so Kavar could see. The screen showed thermal data from her A-10's targeting pod, time-stamped 3 minutes before the engagement. The mountainside where the missile had launched was marked with IR signatures, vehicle tracks, disturbed Earth patterns consistent with prepared positions. Someone had been there for hours, possibly days, waiting with weapons designed specifically to kill aircraft like hers. "They knew you were coming," the civilian said. "It wasn't a question." Kavar studied the imagery, her tactical mind processing what she was seeing against what she'd experienced. The launch point had perfect sight lines to the Ranger's objective area. The position was defendable, supplied, and professionally camouflaged. This wasn't opportunistic fire. This was an operational ambush executed with the kind of planning that required intelligence, resources, and time. Her stomach tightened as implications cascaded through her thoughts. "If they knew I was coming," she said slowly, "then they knew the Ranger mission profile. They knew timing, approach vectors, and package composition. That's not battlefield intelligence. That's operational security compromise." She looked up at Brennan. "Sir, are we looking at a leak?" "We're looking at a pattern," Brennan replied. He pulled up more imagery. 4 other incidents across 3 months, all involving A-10 close air support missions, all featuring similar ambush profiles. 2 aircraft had been damaged and recovered. One had been shot down completely, the pilot recovered by CSAR but the aircraft lost. And now Kavar's engagement made 4, the most sophisticated and nearly successful. Someone is specifically targeting Warthog missions supporting special operations. They're learning, adapting, and improving with each engagement. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Kavar wasn't just a lucky pilot who'd survived impossible damage. She was a data point in an enemy pattern analysis, a target in someone's operational planning. The implications extended far beyond one shot-up aircraft and into questions about how the enemy was tracking American missions, what intelligence networks they'd compromised, and how deep the problem ran. "Captain," the civilian said, "we need you to consider the possibility that your name might be on a list, not randomly, specifically." He paused, watching her reaction. "We've intercepted communications suggesting enemy forces are tracking individual American pilots, building profiles, learning habits. Your call sign has appeared in 3 separate intercepts over the past month." Widow, they knew her call sign. They knew enough to track her missions, analyze her tactics, and set traps where she'd be most vulnerable. Kavar felt a cold weight settle in her chest, not fear exactly, but the uncomfortable awareness that she'd become someone's specific problem to solve. Being a target was part of combat aviation. Being a tracked target, hunted with premeditation and intelligence support, was something different entirely. "What do they know about me?" she asked. Her voice remained steady, but her hands had gone still, coffee forgotten. Brennan exchanged glances with the civilian, then pulled up a document dense with redacted text and intelligence community classification markings. "More than they should, more than we're comfortable with." He rotated the screen. "They know your call sign, your squadron, your deployment timeline. They know you're a single parent. They know you flew rescue helicopters before transitioning to the A-10. And they know you're very, very good at close air support in complex terrain." The revelation landed like physical weight. Enemy forces somewhere in the Sahara weren't just shooting at American aircraft. They were hunting specific pilots with enough intelligence fidelity to know personal details, operational specialties, and predictive patterns. This wasn't insurgent opportunism. This was professional targeting by an adversary with resources, intelligence networks, and strategic objectives. "Why me?" Kavar asked. "I'm not special operations. I don't fly strike packages into denied territory. I'm a hog driver doing CAS for ground troops. Why would anyone burn advanced weapons and operational intelligence tracking my missions?" "Because you're effective," the civilian said. "Because the Rangers and Special Forces specifically request you when missions get complicated. Because in the last 4 months, you've flown 37 combat missions supporting high-value operations, and 36 of them succeeded without friendly casualties. You've become someone enemy planners recognize as a problem worth solving. And that," he added quietly, "makes you extremely valuable to us and extremely dangerous to them." The room fell silent as Kavar absorbed this. She'd never thought of herself as exceptional, just experienced. She flew her missions, supported her people, and went home to call her daughter before lights out. The idea that someone on the other side of the battlefield knew her name, studied her tactics, and allocated scarce resources to removing her from the fight felt surreal and deeply personal in a way combat had never been before. "So what now?" she asked. "Do I stand down, change call signs, transfer to a different theater?" "No," Brennan said firmly. "We need you flying, but we're going to make some changes to how you operate." He pulled up a new briefing slide, this one showing modified flight profiles, enhanced security protocols, and something called Operation Crosswind. "You're going to help us identify who's tracking our pilots and how they're doing it, and then we're going to shut them down." Kavar looked at the briefing materials, at the mission parameters being laid out before her, and understood what they were really asking. They wanted her to be bait, to continue flying missions while intelligence assets watched the enemy's response patterns, traced their communication networks, and mapped their command structure. She would be the visible piece on the board while others worked in darkness to dismantle the network hunting American pilots. It was dangerous, it was necessary, and it was exactly the kind of mission she'd signed up to fly. "When do we start?" she asked. 24 hours later, Kavar was back in the cockpit of a different A-10, this one bearing the tail number 810992. The aircraft had been configured with additional defensive systems, upgraded radar warning receivers, infrared missile approach warning systems, and chaff flare dispensers with increased capacity. The modifications were subtle enough to avoid detection, but significant enough to give her better odds against sophisticated threats. Intelligence crews had briefed her on recognition patterns, what enemy communications looked like before attacks, which frequencies showed activity, what thermal signatures indicated prepared positions. She flew with a new wingman, call sign Granite 43, a younger captain named Tors who'd been read into the operation. He was good, aggressive when needed and disciplined when required, but more importantly he was survivable. If Kavar drew fire again, Tors knew to document everything. Launch points, missile signatures, targeting patterns, anything intelligence could use to trace the network. They weren't just flying close air support anymore. They were flying operational intelligence collection under the guise of routine missions. The first 3 missions went quiet. Standard CAS profiles supporting Army infantry in the border regions, routine patterns, no unusual activity. Kavar flew with precision, providing exactly the kind of effective support that had made her a target, while Tors maintained formation and recorded everything on his advanced sensor suite. Intelligence analysts reviewed their footage each evening, building pattern recognition algorithms and tracking communication intercepts. The enemy was watching. Everyone could feel it, but they weren't striking. On the 4th mission, supporting a reconnaissance element in the Tamsna region, the enemy revealed themselves. It started with radio activity on frequencies intelligence had flagged, encrypted burst transmissions that indicated coordination and command authority. Kavar and Tors maintained their flight profile, pretending ignorance while their systems recorded locations and signal characteristics. Then, 18 minutes into the mission, Kavar's radar warning receiver lit up with missile launch indication. Granite 42 spike 9 o'clock break left. Tors called, his voice controlled but urgent. Kavar rolled hard, dispensing flares in programmed sequences while diving toward terrain. The missile climbed after her, its infrared seeker tracking, adjusting, compensating for her countermeasures. This was another sophisticated weapon, 4th-generation technology that shouldn't have been in theater. She continued braking, trading altitude for angles, forcing the missile into a pursuit geometry that bled its energy. At the last possible moment, she pulled inverted and climbed, sun at her back, dispensing her remaining flares directly into the missile's seeker head. The Verba lost lock, its guidance system overwhelmed and detonated 300 meters behind her aircraft. Shrapnel peppered her tail section, alarms screamed, but nothing critical was hit. Kavar rolled wings level, her heart hammering, and checked her systems. Everything worked. She was still mission capable, still in the fight. Granite 42, you still with me? Tors called, his relief audible. Affirm 4-3. Light damage, all systems green. Target that launch point. Her voice was steady, professional, but something cold had settled in her chest. They'd tried again. They'd tracked her, positioned themselves, and fired another advanced missile at her aircraft. This wasn't just battlefield tactics anymore. This was personal targeting, and they weren't going to stop until they succeeded or she stopped them. Tors prosecuted the launch site with 2 Mavericks, the missiles streaking downward and detonating with precision that left nothing but crater and debris. But intelligence had what they needed: exact coordinates, signal intercepts, and thermal data showing the enemy support network. Ground teams would exploit the site within hours, pulling intelligence from equipment fragments and communications equipment. The pattern was becoming clear, and with each engagement, they learned more about who was hunting American pilots and why. Back at base, Brennan met her on the flight line with an expression that mixed concern and satisfaction. "They took the bait again," he said. "We got clean intercepts this time. Voice communications, command authorization, the works. We're close to identifying their command structure." Kavar pulled off her helmet, her flight suit soaked with sweat, adrenaline still singing through her nerves. How many more times do I need to get shot at before we can roll these people up? Maybe one more, Brennan admitted. Maybe two. I know what I'm asking, Captain. I know the risk. But we're seeing a network that extends beyond this theater, beyond these tactical engagements. If we can map it completely, we shut down targeting operations against American pilots across multiple regions. What you're doing matters beyond your missions. She looked at her damaged A-10, at the shrapnel holes in the tail section, and thought about her daughter waiting for video calls that might never come. This was the job. This was what service meant when you stripped away the ceremony and left only the essential question. What were you willing to risk for the people counting on you? The Rangers on the ground trusted her to be overhead when they needed fire support. Other pilots were flying missions that would be safer if the targeting network died. Her daughter deserved a world where American service members weren't hunted with precision intelligence and advanced weapons. Then let's finish it, Kavar said. But when this is over, someone needs to explain how they got this much information about our operations in the first place. Because I'm flying with half the story and people are trying to kill me with the other half. Brennan nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth she'd spoken. The investigation into how enemy forces had acquired such detailed intelligence about American pilots was ongoing, running parallel to the operational targeting. The answers, when they came, would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. But that was a problem for intelligence analysts and security investigators. Kavar's problem was simpler and more immediate. Fly the missions, survive the engagements, and help dismantle the network hunting her before they finally succeeded. The next mission launched 72 hours later, supporting a joint terminal attack controller embedded with a Marine reconnaissance unit operating near the Algerian border. The mission profile was textbook high-risk, complex terrain, known enemy presence, and targets requiring precision fires within danger-close distances of friendly forces. It was exactly the kind of mission that showcased Kavar's skills, and exactly the kind of mission the enemy network would prioritize targeting. Intelligence predicted a 90% probability of engagement. Everyone involved understood this might be the confrontation that ended the operation one way or another. Kavar and Tors launched at dawn, their A-10s loaded with full combat packages and every defensive system active. The flight east was quiet, morning light painting the Sahara in shades of copper and gold. Radio communications followed standard protocols, but underneath the routine calls, everyone on the net understood the stakes. Somewhere below, enemy forces were tracking their approach, running calculations, and preparing weapons that had already proven capable of killing American aircraft. The JTAC, call sign Reaper 26, marked targets with practiced efficiency. Enemy positions dug into a ridgeline overlooking a valley where Marine vehicles were pinned down by accurate fire. The tactical situation was clean. Friendly forces marked with infrared strobes, enemy positions identified with laser designation, separation sufficient for safe prosecution. Kavar rolled in for her first gun run, the Avenger cannon in her nose spinning up to fire. That's when the battlefield exploded with coordinated fire. Not one missile launch, but 3 simultaneous shots from different positions, a perfectly orchestrated ambush designed to overwhelm defensive systems through saturation. Kavar saw the launch warnings, felt the cold spike of combat adrenaline, and reacted with instincts honed through 200 combat missions. She broke hard right while Tors broke left, both aircraft dispensing chaff and flares, their formation splitting to divide the targeting problem. 2 missiles tracked Kavar, their seekers locked, closing at Mach 3. She jinked and rolled, trading altitude for angles, forcing the missiles into energy-bleeding pursuit geometries while her countermeasures filled the air with false targets. The first Verba lost lock and self-destructed. The second followed her through the defensive maneuvers, its sophisticated seeker compensating, adjusting, tracking through her countermeasures with terrifying precision. At 400 meters, Kavar pulled a maximum G brake that made her vision gray, the A-10's airframe groaning, and dispensed her final flares directly into the missile's path. The Verba detonated 50 meters from her aircraft, close enough that shrapnel shredded her left wing, punching through aluminum and severing hydraulic lines. The A-10 yawed hard left, rolling uncontrollably, and for one terrible moment Kavar thought she'd lost it. Then her hands found the stick, her feet corrected on rudders, and she used pure mechanical reversion to level the wings. The aircraft flew, barely, trailing smoke and fluid, but it flew. 4-2 is hit, still mission capable, she transmitted, her voice tight with strain. 4-3, prosecute the launch sites. Torres was already rolling in, his gun camera recording everything as he identified the 3 enemy positions and marked them for follow-on fires. The coordination was obvious now. 3 separate teams working with unified command, sophisticated weapons, and tactical discipline. This wasn't insurgent resistance. This was professional military operations conducted by an adversary with training, resources, and strategic objectives. Kavar stayed on station, despite her damage, coordinating fires from altitude while Torres and the JTAC prosecuted targets. The Marines broke contact and withdrew under cover of A-10 guns, their casualties evacuated, their mission compromised but survivable. It took 40 minutes to clear the battlefield and another 20 to coordinate the combat search and rescue package that would exploit the enemy positions. By the time Kavar turned for home, her left wing was barely attached and her hydraulics were reading 0 pressure. She made it back to base on emergency systems and pure determination, landing with battle damage that would have made her first deadstick arrival look minor. This time both main gear collapsed, the aircraft sliding on its belly, sparks and grinding metal, until momentum finally stopped and emergency crews surrounded her with foam. Kavar climbed out through smoke and chemical fire retardant, refused the stretcher again, and walked to the debriefing room while maintenance crews stared at the wreckage she'd brought home. Brennan was waiting with the civilian and a third man Kavar didn't recognize, someone whose quiet authority and lack of visible rank suggested positions too elevated for insignia. They sat her down, gave her water she didn't drink, and showed her what they'd captured during the engagement. Voice intercepts, command authorizations, financial transactions, and communications routing that traced back through 3 countries to a single operations center. "We have them," Brennan said quietly. "The network, command structure, financing, supply chains, everything. And we have it because you were willing to be shot at until they revealed themselves completely." He paused. "JSOC is moving tonight. Coordinated strikes across 4 locations. By sunrise, the network targeting American pilots will cease to exist." Kavar looked at the intelligence maps, at the faces and organizations connected by lines of operational command, and felt something release in her chest. It was done. The missions, the risk, the days of flying with the knowledge that someone was hunting her specifically, all of it was finally finished. She'd been bait, and the trap had worked, and now people smarter and more lethal than her would finish what she'd started. "There's something else," the unnamed official said. His voice carried the kind of careful weight used for delivering news that changed people. "The intelligence compromise, we found it, not external penetration, not technical surveillance, human source, someone inside the targeting chain passing mission profiles to the enemy network." He paused. "An analyst at division level. We've had eyes on him for 72 hours. He's in custody now." The betrayal felt physical, a violation of trust that went deeper than enemy fire. Someone with access to American operational planning had sold out pilots, ground troops, and missions to an adversary for reasons that would probably prove embarrassingly mundane: money, ideology, or personal grievance. Kavar thought about the Rangers she'd supported, the missions she'd flown, the close calls that had almost killed her, and understood that every one of those moments had been enabled by someone who'd chosen betrayal over honor. "I want to know why," she said quietly. "I want to know what was worth selling out American lives." Money, the official replied, his voice heavy with contempt. $60,000 over 6 months. He sold operational intelligence to a broker who sold it to the network. He didn't ask questions about what they'd do with it. He just took payment and kept feeding them mission profiles. The official's expression hardened. He'll spend the rest of his life in military prison, but that won't undo the damage or bring back the pilot we lost. Kavar sat in silence, processing the banality of that betrayal. $60,000, less than a year's salary for a captain, less than what she'd spend on her daughter's education. Someone had valued that sum over the lives of American service members, over the trust that made military operations possible, over everything service was supposed to mean. The anger that rose in her chest was cold and focused, the kind of rage that didn't need expression because it simply was. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest," Brennan said. "You've flown your last combat mission of this deployment. The network is being rolled up, the compromise is sealed, and the threat to American pilots is contained. You've done your job, Captain, and you've done it with more courage than anyone had the right to ask." He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. "The Rangers you supported are putting you in for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The civilian leadership wants to brief Congress on what you did. And your squadron commander is probably going to ground you for a month because you've given him stress ulcers. Take the win, Captain. You've earned it." They left her alone in the debriefing room, surrounded by imagery and intelligence reports that documented what she'd survived and what she'd accomplished. Kavar sat quietly, too tired for triumph, too numb for relief. She'd flown 24 combat missions while being actively hunted, survived 2 catastrophic engagement attempts, and helped dismantle a network that threatened every American pilot in theater. The work had been necessary, the risk unavoidable, the outcome successful. But success in combat felt different than success in any other endeavor. It tasted like jet fuel and exhaustion, looked like broken aircraft and damaged wings, and carried the weight of knowing that survival was sometimes just the absence of something worse. She thought about her daughter, 7 years old, who drew pictures of A-10s and asked questions about clouds, and wanted to understand what Mommy did when she was deployed. How do you explain to a child that her mother had been bait in a military intelligence operation? How do you frame survival as anything other than luck when the margin between success and failure was measured in milliseconds and inches? What would you tell that little girl if the operations hadn't gone perfectly, if the countermeasures had failed, if the network had succeeded in their targeting? Kavar pulled out her phone, looking at the background image, her daughter's school picture, gap-toothed smile, eyes bright with questions about everything. This was why. Not the medals or the recognition or the operational success. This, the knowledge that children like her daughter deserved a world where American service members could do their jobs without being systematically hunted, where operational security meant something, where betrayal carried consequences and networks that targeted her people could be destroyed before they destroyed lives. She dialed home, wading through the international connection lag, and heard her daughter's voice answer bright with excitement. "Mommy, are you coming home soon?" "Soon, baby," Kavar replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on every word. "Just a few more weeks. Tell me about school." Her daughter launched into stories about art class and recess and a friend who could do cartwheels. Normal childhood concerns that felt impossibly precious against the background of everything Kavar had just survived. She listened, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, being present in a way that grounded her more effectively than any debriefing. This was reality. A child who needed her mother, a life waiting beyond combat deployments, a future that required her to come home intact and whole. When the call ended, Kavar sat alone in the quiet operations center and allowed herself one moment of genuine feeling. Not triumph or relief, but simple gratitude for another day breathing, another mission survived, another evening to call home. Tomorrow would bring new briefings, medal ceremonies, and the inevitable questions about her future in combat aviation. But tonight, she'd done her job, protected her people, and helped shut down a network that wouldn't kill any more American pilots. That would have to be enough. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony happened 3 weeks later in a hangar that smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, attended by people whose faces Kavar would forget, but whose presence validated everything she'd survived. The citation detailed her actions: 2 catastrophic engagement survivals, continued operations while being actively targeted, and operational intelligence support that enabled network dismantlement. The medal was heavy, brass and ribbon, weight that meant something to people who understood what combat aviation cost. But the moment that mattered came after the ceremony, when the Ranger element she'd supported during that first impossible flight lined up to meet her. They were quiet, respectful, carrying the particular gravitas of men who'd seen terrible things and made peace with mortality. Their team sergeant, a master sergeant with 23 years and 4 combat deployments, shook her hand and said simply, "You saved our lives. We won't forget." Kavar nodded, accepting the words because they were true and because these men deserved acknowledgement. But she thought about all the other pilots who'd been targeted, the one who died before the network was discovered, the close calls and near misses that populated the operational record. Her survival felt less like individual heroism and more like statistical outcome. She'd been lucky, skilled, and supported by people who'd used her risk to achieve operational objectives. The line between heroism and fortune was thinner than ceremony suggested. Her squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Vasquez who'd flown A-10 since before Kavar was born, pulled her aside after the ceremony. "How are you really doing?" he asked. No ceremony, no official concern, just genuine inquiry from someone who understood combat aviation's particular psychological costs. "I'm fine," Kavar said, then reconsidered. "I'm functional, I can fly, I'm processing what happened. Ask me again in 6 months and I'll give you a better answer." Vasquez nodded slowly. "You know you don't have to go back up immediately. Medical can clear you for administrative duties. No one would question it after what you went through." "I need to fly," Kavar replied. "Not combat missions, not yet, but I need to get back in the cockpit and remember that flying is more than getting shot at." She paused, choosing words carefully. "I became a pilot because I loved aviation. Somewhere in the last few weeks I forgot that. I need to remember." She flew training missions for the next 2 weeks. Basic handling, aerobatics, formation work, the fundamental skills that made aviation more than transportation. Without the weight of combat, without the knowledge that someone was hunting her, flying felt different. Joyful, pure, the thing she'd fallen in love with years ago before war complicated everything. The A-10 responded to her hands with familiar grace, and she remembered why she'd chosen this particular aircraft. Not because it was sophisticated or fast, but because it was honest. The Warthog did exactly what you told it to do, nothing more or less, and that straightforward relationship felt increasingly valuable. Her deployment ended on a clear morning in March, departure processed through the administrative machinery that returned deployed personnel to home stations. Kavar flew commercial out of City Buzid, military transport to Germany, then commercial again to Andrews and finally home. 26 hours of travel compressed into metal seats and recycled air. Surrounded by civilians who had no idea that the tired woman in comfortable clothes had recently deadsticked a battle-damaged attack aircraft across 300 miles of desert while being actively hunted by an enemy network. Her daughter was waiting at arrivals, holding a sign that said "Welcome Home, Mommy," decorated with crayon A-10s and clouds. Kavar dropped her bags and lifted her daughter into a hug that felt like every good thing worth protecting, worth surviving for, worth risking everything to come home to. They stood like that for a long moment, mother and daughter, while travelers flowed around them, and life continued with the beautiful indifference of a world at peace. "Did you fly good?" her daughter asked, pulling back to look at her mother's face. "Yeah, baby," Kavar replied, meaning it in ways that had nothing to do with technical proficiency and everything to do with making choices that allowed this moment to happen. I flew good. They drove home together, talking about school and friends and the hamster they'd maybe get if Mommy promised to help take care of it. Normal life resumed with normal concerns, and Kavar let herself sink into the comfortable routine of parenting, household management, and post-deployment decompression. The nightmares would come later as they always did, but for now she focused on being present, being whole, being the mother her daughter deserved. The debrief from higher headquarters came 2 weeks later. Secure facility, classified briefing, people whose names she wouldn't remember explaining operational outcomes and strategic implications. The network she'd helped dismantle had connections to state-level actors, supply chains that spanned 3 continents, and operational objectives that extended well beyond targeting American pilots. Rolling it up had prevented future attacks, compromised enemy intelligence operations, and validated new tactics for identifying and eliminating sophisticated threats. Her actions, combined with intelligence exploitation and special operations targeting, had achieved effects that would reverberate through enemy planning for years. "You changed how we think about aircrew protection," one analyst explained, showing slides dense with operational graphics. "The idea of using targeted pilots as intelligence sources while simultaneously protecting them with enhanced defensive systems, that's doctrine now. You proved it works." Kavar listened, nodded at appropriate moments, and tried to see her experience through their strategic lens. But what she remembered wasn't doctrine or operational success. She remembered the moment her left engine exploded, the sound of alarms screaming while she fought to keep flying, the knowledge that people on the ground needed her to stay in the fight despite catastrophic damage. She remembered her hands on the stick, coaxing a dying aircraft through impossible maneuvers, and the quiet moment after landing when she'd stood beside the wreckage and understood how close she'd come to never seeing her daughter again. "What's next for you, Captain?" the senior officer asked. He was a brigadier general whose career had included command at every level, someone who understood both strategic implications and personal costs. "You've done important work. Where do you see yourself going from here?" Kavar considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have answered with career trajectory: upgrade to flight lead, pursue instructor pilot qualification, maybe staff positions that led toward squadron command. But combat had recalibrated her understanding of what mattered. Her daughter was 7, at an age where presence mattered more than career advancement. Her body carried the accumulated stress of too many combat missions flown too close together. Her mind needed time to process what she'd survived and what it meant for how she thought about service, risk, and responsibility. "I'd like to instruct," she said finally, "new pilots transitioning to the A-10. Teach them what I learned about staying alive, about making good decisions under pressure, about why we fly these missions and what they cost when we get them wrong. The technical skills matter, but the judgment matters more. I'd like to help build that in the next generation." The general nodded slowly, understanding. "We'll make that happen. You've earned the right to choose your next assignment." He paused, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, Captain, what you did matters beyond operational outcomes. You showed people what's possible when skill meets courage. That's not doctrine, that's leadership. Don't lose sight of that." The meeting ended with handshakes and classification reminders, and Kavar returned to the parking lot feeling lighter than she had in months. The work was done. The network was destroyed. Her combat deployment was finished, and the future contained choices rather than obligations. She drove home, picked up her daughter from school, and made dinner while listening to stories about art class and playground dynamics. This was what peace looked like. Ordinary moments stacked into ordinary days, precious specifically because they were unremarkable. But 3 months later, Kava received a call that would pull her back into the world she thought she'd left behind. The voice on the phone belonged to Colonel Brennan, the intelligence officer who'd run the operation that made her bait for an enemy network. He was calling about a new threat, a different targeting pattern, and a request for consultation that would require temporary duty in a classified facility outside Washington. "We're seeing indicators," Brennan said carefully, aware they were speaking on an unsecure line. "Similar to before, but more sophisticated. Different theater, different threat profile, but the pattern analysis suggests organizational learning from what we shut down. We need your insight on how they might adapt their tactics based on what worked and what failed when they targeted you." Kavar stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, looking at her daughter's artwork on the refrigerator. She'd promised herself she was done with this particular kind of work. She'd transitioned to instruction, settled into a routine that didn't involve being shot at, and started rebuilding a life that had space for normal concerns. But Brennan was saying other pilots were being targeted, that the enemy had learned from their first attempt, that her experience could help protect people flying missions similar to what she'd survived. "When do you need me?" she asked, already knowing she'd go. "2 weeks. We'll handle the orders, the child care arrangements, everything. This is voluntary, Captain. You've done enough. But if you're willing, your contribution could prevent what you went through from happening to someone else." She thought about the Ranger Team sergeant's words. "You saved our lives." Thought about the pilot who died before the first network was discovered. Thought about all the young aviators transitioning to the A-10 who'd face threats that evolved faster than doctrine could adapt. The choice wasn't really a choice, not for someone who understood what service meant beyond ceremony. "I'll be there," Kavar said. "Send the orders." The temporary duty stretched from 2 weeks into 6 as the threat analysis revealed complexity no one had anticipated. The enemy hadn't just adapted, they'd evolved their entire operational concept. Instead of targeting individual pilots through predictable mission patterns, they were now using artificial intelligence to analyze aircraft performance characteristics, predict pilot decision-making, and position ambushes based on statistical modeling of how specific aircrews would respond to tactical situations. The sophistication represented a quantum leap in capability and indicated state-level investment in systems designed specifically to kill American combat pilots. Kavar sat in briefing rooms with intelligence analysts, operational planners, and technical specialists whose expertise ranged from machine learning to missile guidance systems. They walked through scenarios, tested tactical responses, and built countermeasures based on her experience surviving coordinated targeting. What emerged was a new doctrine for combat aviation in contested environments: dynamic flight profiles that defeated pattern recognition, enhanced defensive systems integrated with threat warning networks, and tactics that turned the enemy's technological sophistication against them. "They're using your survival as a baseline," one analyst explained, showing algorithm outputs that modeled how she'd responded to missile engagements. "The AI studies what you did, identifies decision points, and generates tactics designed to exploit what worked and eliminate options that allowed you to survive. So we're building systems that disrupt the AI's ability to predict, that introduce chaos into situations where they expect pattern recognition to give them advantage." It was simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. She'd survived sophisticated attacks, and now her survival was being studied by enemy systems to make future attacks more effective. But the analysis worked both ways. If the enemy was learning from her, then understanding that learning process revealed vulnerabilities in their systems. Pattern recognition algorithms needed patterns. Eliminate the patterns, introduce unpredictability, and even sophisticated AI couldn't generate effective tactics. The solution was elegant. Don't eliminate human judgment from aviation, enhance it. Build systems that empowered pilots to make unpredictable decisions within tactical parameters, that gave them real-time threat assessment without constraining their options, that treated human intuition as feature rather than limitation. The A-10's design philosophy: simplicity, survivability, pilot authority, became the foundation for next-generation combat aviation doctrine. Kavar's survival hadn't been despite her aircraft's limitations, but because of its straightforward honesty. That principle now informed how the Air Force thought about aircrew protection in denied environments. 6 months after returning from that first temporary duty, Kavar was flying operational test missions in A-10s equipped with prototype defensive systems built around the doctrine she'd helped develop. The aircraft looked identical to standard Warthogs, but underneath the familiar titanium bathtub and twin engines lay sensor networks that processed threats faster than human reaction time, while leaving final tactical decisions to pilot judgment. The systems didn't fly the aircraft. They simply gave Kavar better information, faster, allowing her to make decisions that defeated threat prediction algorithms. The test program ran for 18 months, culminating in a deployment back to the Sahara where she'd first been targeted. The mission profiles were similar: close air support for ground forces, complex terrain, known threats. But this time she flew with enhanced defensive systems, updated tactics, and the knowledge that enemy networks were watching, analyzing, and adapting. The difference was measurable. Threat engagements dropped 70%, successful shootdowns decreased to near zero, and pilots reported higher confidence operating in contested environments. Standing on the flight line after a successful test mission, Kavar watched the sun set over the Sahara and thought about how far she'd come from that first impossible deadstick landing. She'd survived being targeted, helped dismantle the network hunting her, transitioned to instruction, been pulled back into operational development, and now flew missions that validated doctrine built partly from her experience. The arc felt complete in a way that satisfied something deeper than career progression or personal achievement. Her daughter was 10 now, old enough to understand that mommy's job sometimes meant deploying to distant places, old enough to be proud rather than just confused. They video called regularly, maintaining connection across time zones and operational security restrictions. Kavar told edited stories about flying, about supporting people on the ground, about why service mattered. Her daughter listened with the particular intensity of children trying to understand their parents' choices, and Kavar hoped she was learning something useful about courage, service, and what it meant to choose difficulty in pursuit of purposes larger than personal comfort. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a display case at home, brass and ribbon, accompanied now by other decorations accumulated through years of operational service. Kavar rarely looked at the medals, but occasionally she'd catch her daughter standing before the display, studying the awards with an expression that mixed pride and puzzlement. Those moments felt more valuable than ceremony. The quiet transmission of values from one generation to the next, the understanding that some things were worth risking everything to protect. 20 years later, Colonel Nadia Kavar stood in a different hangar, addressing a different audience. She was older now, her flight suit replaced by service dress, her combat deployments finished, and her operational career transitioned into leadership positions that influenced how the Air Force trained and equipped its combat aviators. The young pilots before her, fresh from basic flight training, listened with the particular attention given to speakers who'd actually done the things they were describing. The A-10 survives because it's simple, Kavar told them. Because it trusts pilot judgment over technological complexity. Because it's designed around the assumption that combat aviation is fundamentally about human decision-making under pressure. All the sensors and defensive systems and artificial intelligence in the world can't replace that moment when you have to choose. Punch out or stay in the fight, break left or break right, prosecute the target or abort the run. Those decisions are why we exist. She talked about her combat deployments, about being targeted and surviving, about how experience taught judgment that couldn't be programmed or proceduralized. She talked about fear, about making good decisions despite it, about why the mission mattered enough to accept risks that terrified any rational person. The young pilots listened, seeing their possible futures reflected in her stories, understanding that aviation was more than technical proficiency. "You'll be scared," Kavar continued. "Everyone is, but fear is just information. It tells you the stakes are high, that consequences matter, that your decisions affect people depending on you. Use it. Let it sharpen your focus, but never let it make your decisions. That's what training is for, building judgment so good that even when you're terrified, you make the right call." After the lecture, a young lieutenant approached, nervousness evident in the way she held her flight cap. "Ma'am, I'm heading to A-10 training next month. I've read about what you did. I was wondering, do you think someone like me could do what you did? Could I be that good?" Kavar looked at the young woman, seeing herself 20 years earlier, full of questions and determination, and the particular uncertainty that preceded combat experience. The answer wasn't simple because competence in aviation came from accumulated experience, mistakes survived, and lessons learned through repetition. But beneath the technical question lay something more fundamental. Was she brave enough, tough enough, good enough to measure up? "I wasn't special," Kavar said honestly. "I was trained, experienced, and focused on doing my job. When things went wrong, I used what I knew and made the best decisions I could. You can do that. Everyone can. It's not about being exceptional. It's about being prepared and trusting your training when everything is falling apart. The A-10 will keep you alive if you fly it right. The question isn't whether you can do what I did. It's whether you'll put in the work to be ready when the moment comes." The lieutenant nodded, processing the words, and Kavar saw understanding replace uncertainty. This was why she'd transitioned from operations to instruction. These moments when experience transmitted across generations, when lessons paid for in fear and adrenaline became knowledge that kept the next generation alive. Her combat missions were finished, but the work continued in different form, and that felt right. She thought about her daughter, now in her 20s, pursuing her own career in ways that had nothing to do with military service, but everything to do with values learned watching her mother's example. She thought about the pilots she'd instructed, now flying combat missions in distant theaters, using tactics she'd helped develop. She thought about the network that had hunted her, destroyed now, but its lessons persisting in doctrine that protected aviators facing similar threats. The work had mattered. The survival had purpose beyond personal fortune. The years had transformed individual experience into institutional knowledge that would outlive her. Colonel Kava returned to her office, processed paperwork, attended meetings about training programs and operational requirements. The work was administrative now, but it connected directly to combat effectiveness, and that made it meaningful. She'd flown her missions, survived her battles, and earned the right to influence how the next generation prepared for their own. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was exactly what service meant when you understood it properly, using what you'd learned to make things better for people following the path you'd walked. Evening came, as it always did, and Kavar drove home through familiar streets to a life that had grown comfortable through years of accumulated routine. She thought about the young lieutenant's question, about whether she could be that good, and realized the answer had always been simpler than it seemed. Competence came from preparation. Courage came from commitment to purposes larger than personal safety. Survival came from making good decisions despite fear. Those weren't exceptional qualities. They were fundamental aspects of professionalism, available to anyone willing to do the work. She'd been that young lieutenant once, uncertain and determined, learning to fly because she loved aviation and discovering along the way what it meant to serve. The path had included moments of terror, impossible situations, and choices that still occasionally haunted her dreams. But it had also included the best aspects of human experience: purpose, service, connection to something larger than individual existence. She'd protected people who needed protection, taught people who needed teaching, and lived according to principles she believed worthwhile. The A-10 that saved her life was long since retired, 790147 sitting in a museum somewhere with a plaque explaining its significance. But the aircraft's descendants still flew, still provided close air support to troops in contact, still embodied the design philosophy that had kept Kavar alive. Simple, survivable, honest. Those qualities transcended specific airframes and generations of pilots, forming through lines connecting everyone who'd ever chosen to climb into a titanium bathtub and fly into hostile fire because people on the ground needed help. Her call sign was Widow, earned through circumstances that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with personal loss survived years before her military service. The name had proven prophetic in ways she couldn't have imagined. She'd flown missions that should have killed her, survived damage that destroyed aircraft, and returned home when statistics said she shouldn't. But the call sign also represented survival, resilience, and the capacity to continue functioning when everything suggested you should stop. Those qualities defined not just her aviation career but her approach to life. Colonel Nadia Kavar sat in her living room that evening, reviewing training materials for the next day's instruction, and thought about legacy. Not the official kind preserved in service records and decoration citations, but the meaningful kind transmitted through teaching, example, and the quiet influence of living according to principles you believed worthwhile. Her daughter understood service, not because Kavar had lectured her about it, but because she'd watched her mother make choices that demonstrated what service meant. The young pilots she'd instructed carried lessons learned through her experience, applying them in situations Kavar would never witness. The doctrine she'd helped develop protected aviators facing threats she'd helped identify. That was legacy. Not monuments or remembrance, but living influence that continued affecting people and outcomes long after individual actions were forgotten. Kavar had survived being targeted, had helped destroy the network hunting her, and had used that experience to make military aviation safer and more effective. The work had cost her in fear, exhaustion, and accumulated stress that marked her in ways that never fully healed. But the work had mattered, and that made the costs worthwhile. She closed her laptop, turned off lights, and went to bed knowing tomorrow would bring more instruction, more administrative work, more incremental contributions to an institution that would outlive her. The dramatic moments were finished. The impossible flights were history. What remained was the steady work of transmitting knowledge, maintaining standards, and ensuring that the next generation of combat aviators was prepared to face whatever threats emerged from evolving technology and persistent adversaries. Outside, stars filled the sky above suburban Virginia, the same stars she'd navigated by during night missions over the Sahara. The continuity felt reassuring, celestial mechanics indifferent to human concerns, providing eternal reference points for navigation and orientation. Kavar had used those stars to find her way home after impossible damage, and now they simply marked another evening in an ordinary life. The transition from combat to peace, from drama to routine, from survival to comfortable existence, that was the real story of military service. The moments of terror were brief. The years of normal life were what you built with the time those moments purchased. She slept peacefully, as she usually did now, the nightmares that once marked her nights having faded through time and distance from the events that spawned them. Her last thought before sleep was simple gratitude for another day completed, another evening safe at home, another tomorrow waiting with its familiar concerns. The spectacular was finished. The ordinary was precious, and she'd earned the right to appreciate the difference.